Welcome back to No to NATO, No to War. After an absence of some time due to electoral battles having to take priority, we now have to focus on the drive to war in the world being embarked upon by the empire in the United States with its faithful adjutants in Britain, in Germany, and in France, and lesser places too. The danger of World War III has never been more severe. If I had a doomsday clock in front of me now, it would be showing at merely a few seconds from midnight. Everyone watching this probably knows that already in their heart, but the news is coming thick and fast to suggest, to indicate that battle lines are being drawn and that we are merely a hair trigger away from a war that could rapidly turn into a nuclear conflagration, which could be the end of us all. Therefore, there is no more important battle, no more important political issue than trying to halt the juggernaut of war piloted by a senile dementia patient in the United States and his co-drivers, bereft of political support in their own countries, but nonetheless prepared to sacrifice their own economies, their own people, their own countries to that juggernaut of war. About Joe Biden, I need say little. The fact that after a 12-month absence of US cabinet meetings, he finally held one in the last few days, but was incapable of chairing it and handed it off to his wholly unqualified and unconstitutionally seated Dr. Jill Biden, his wife. In Britain, the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, who started out with only the support of 19% of the British electorate, is now mired in a sleaze scandal, actually one scandal after another, emerging almost hourly. But none of that stops him from faithfully pledging British service personnel's lives and the expensively procured British war materiel for what could be the final war, what could be the final battle. In fact, British government ministers don't even bother to argue their case for what they're doing on the floor of Parliament. And what would be the point in any case? There has never been a more supine Parliament in the entire history of democratic elections in Great Britain than the one that we have today. Scarcely a handful of members out of 650 can be mustered to speak against, even to whimper against, the drive to war. In Germany, the ruling party, led by little soldier Schulz and Anna Baerbock, can barely muster 20% of the polls between them, actually heading south to 15% of the polls between them. People on the left and on the right in Germany are thriving as the center cannot hold, because the center in Germany is the war machine, is the determination to criminalize anyone who stands up for peace, stands up against war in the Middle East and in Eastern Europe. If you don't believe me, try going out on the streets of Germany with a Palestinian flag. Even if you're a small child, you'll be hunted down and shackled and thrown into the back of a police vehicle. Try going out on the streets of Germany with a Russian flag, supporting the moves that could have been and should have been made long ago, 1 million deaths ago, to stop the slaughter in the Ukraine. In France, little Macron, the would-be emperor, who has had the temerity to appoint a government completely opposite to the one that the people of France voted for in a general election that he called. He called a national election and lost it, but went on to appoint one of his own supporters, Michel Barnier, in any case, just in case anybody in the French Parliament thought that they were going to interfere with France's support for the imperialist war drive all over the world. And the money keeps on flowing. Just today, and I'll be asking our American guest about that in just a minute. In this very day, with the government about to shut down, unable to agree a budget, with Americans suffering mass poverty, mass unemployment, mass homelessness, and the crumbling, decaying, and collapse of their infrastructure, roads, bridges, railways, with the absolute social, societal crisis that exists in America, they were determined that if this was to be the last day they could send money to Israel, they were going to do it. And another $7.8 billion, almost another $8 billion, was rushed through in emergency funding for Benjamin Netanyahu. The situation in Lebanon is grave. Hundreds of people were killed in 24 hours. As many as 750 Lebanese have been killed in the last 72 hours. Most of them, just as with Gaza, women and children. Lebanon is in flames, and Israel is in flames, thanks to the retaliatory fire from the Lebanese national resistance. What if this gets out of hand? What if Netanyahu invades Lebanon and faces, as I'm sure that he will, if he decides to do so, faces thousands of casualties amongst his invading force? What if the Lebanese resistance rockets start targeting Tel Aviv, start targeting the Israeli nuclear base at Dimona, start targeting the absolute centers of power in Israel? What happens then? Well, the United States Navy, Air Force, and soldiers are all now present in the Eastern Mediterranean in significant numbers. It's hard to believe that this close to a presidential election, the United States is not going to intervene and enter the war. And if America enters the war, what happens next? Iran surely would be required to intervene on behalf of their co-religionists and in order to teach the United States a lesson that the Middle East is not their backyard, and no self-respecting person in the Middle East will agree to being America's backyard. The backyard is where you keep the trash cans, and the Arab world is no longer prepared to be treated like America's trash. What happens if these long-range weapons that have been given to the Zelensky junta in Kiev are fired deep into Russia, hitting Russia's towns and cities, killing civilians deep inside the Russian Federation? Well, a clue to what will happen was given by President Putin himself yesterday when he declared a refining of Russia's nuclear doctrine, which will now read in shorthand thus: any aggression against the territory of Russia and Belarus will be regarded as triggering a potential countdown to the use of nuclear forces. The Russians aren't messing around. There was a song I used to like, Stalin wasn't Stalin, when he told the beast of Berlin. The Russian leadership today is not Stalin. This is not the Soviet Union, but they're still not messing. Neither are they bluffing. And the day is coming close when the rest of us, at our very great cost, potentially our fatal cost, are going to find that out. So no to NATO, no to war has the possibility of and the mission of uniting all the continents against the drive to war, driven inexorably by NATO. And tonight's platform unites 3 continents, from Australasia, from the Americas, and from Europe in the form of Great Britain. And let's press on with the first of our speakers, an outstanding young woman commentator who has, over the last few years, established an international reputation as an eloquent and wry student of international affairs. She started as a student. She's becoming a master. Her name is Rachel Blevins, and I invite her to address the audience now from the United States of America. Rachel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, George, so much for having me. And yeah, exactly as you were laying it out in your intro there. I mean, we are at a point where, speaking of the United States, they seem to be looking at how can they get to World War III in the fastest possible path. I mean, on one hand, you have the US not just, I want to say fighting, right? But they're funding, they're enabling this proxy war against Russia directly through Ukraine. This week, you have Zelensky here in the US. He's on his apparent victory plan tour, although when it comes to everything that we've learned about his victory plan, it seems to have as much to do with victory as his peace plan ever had to do with peace when he was rolling that out. And yet the Biden administration is cheering him on, right? They're claiming that he has brought a plan that is going to lead Ukraine to victory against Russia. But when you break it down, it looks much more like just a typical NATO wish list that Zelensky is now presenting once again. And what's to say that he won't get it? I mean, he got long-range missiles, he got F-16 fighter jets, he got Abrams tanks. It seems as though all he wants now is to get those restrictions removed on long-range missiles so that he can use them deep inside Russian territory. But as the Russian government has made very clear, they're not stupid. They know that when Kiev, quote unquote, is firing these long-range missiles, that it's not doing it alone. It is being aided directly when it comes to coordinates, when it comes to deciding where to launch it, and all of those different aspects by the United States or by whatever other NATO country is involved. And Russia's made it clear, look, if you remove these restrictions, if you allow these attacks, we see that as a direct attack, not just from Ukraine, but also from NATO, from the NATO members that are so directly involved. And yet the Biden administration seems to be seeing this escalation, right? And they're not doing anything about it. Instead, they're further escalating the situation. And while they're doing that, they're also sitting back and enabling an all-out genocide to be committed by Israel in the Gaza Strip against the Palestinian people there. They've been doing just that for the last year. And in the last 2 weeks, we've been in a position where we're watching Israel escalate tensions against Lebanon. And I say against Lebanon because they are directly targeting the Lebanese people, not just Hezbollah as they claim that they are. We saw 2 days of terror attacks carried out by Israel last week that has then gone into just unimaginable bombings this week. You've seen over 600 people killed by Israel in Lebanon. Nearly 100,000 have been displaced from their homes. And yet Israel's sitting back and it's teasing the possibility of a ground invasion. And yet what is the United States doing? Oh, well, you've got the US today throwing out the possibility of a 21-day ceasefire. And they're asking Israel to agree to it. And it is just bizarre to me to think that in this day and age, when everything that Israel does is made possible by the US, that the US is somehow asking them, will you agree to a ceasefire, right? Will you agree to this plan? If the Biden administration or any US administration had any backbone, they would be calling Israel up and saying, this is what's going to happen. You're going to stop bombing the Lebanese people, the Palestinian people, you name it. And until you do stop, there's going to be an arms embargo. We are going to freeze any sort of military aid, and we're going to call on all of our other allies to do the same. But the US hasn't done that, doesn't show any sign that it's even willing to do that. And I think that that's incredibly telling about the fact that the US is in this power position in so many different places, and yet when it has power, it continues to refuse to use it, allowing its allies to carry out massacre after massacre, and the world is watching right now.
In another time, Rachel, in 1956, in the Suez Crisis, the American leadership did exactly that. They ordered France and Britain and Israel to cease and desist their invasion of Egypt, their attempt to seize the Suez Canal that had been nationalized by the Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser. And that actually marked a decisive change in world affairs and put France and Britain in the box in which they still sit more than half a century later. But this American presidency of Biden-Harris, if we give it its proper name, though everyone knows, not even Mrs. Biden is making these decisions, the Biden-Harris administration, in refusing to demand a halt to the massive assault on Lebanon, make themselves culpable. And I want to ask you how the American election plays into this. My reading is that Kamala Harris cannot win the presidency without winning Michigan, for example, without winning Wisconsin, without winning Pennsylvania. No Democrat ever has. And I personally know of at least 500,000 Lebanese people, voters, living in Michigan. I've myself met thousands of them, addressed thousands of them in person. Whilst Lebanese blood is running in the streets of their homeland from which their parents came, how can Harris possibly expect Arab Americans, Muslim Americans to vote for her?
Yeah, that is an excellent question. And it is still baffling to me to see the way in which Harris and her campaign, they're not even trying, right? They initially tried when they came on the scene. They looked at Biden. They knew that he had received the nickname of Genocide Joe. And so they were a little bit careful, right? You had Harris come out and claim that I'm not going to stay silent about the suffering of the Palestinians, that this war has gone on long enough. And she makes it sound like she cares. But in the case of Lebanon, and arguably for her, still in the case of Palestine, she doesn't care. She does not care about those voters, about the Americans who have either close personal ties to whether that be to Palestine and Lebanon, or who just genuinely have a conscience and they care about the ongoing genocide and about Israel spreading its genocidal war crimes around the region. And because of that, I mean, it has been almost kind of fascinating to watch the sheer lack of care coming from either one of the two major parties here in the United States. I mean, we know Donald Trump. We know what he did when he was in office, that he illegally recognized the Golan Heights. He illegally moved the U.S. Embassy to West Jerusalem. We're aware of his support for Israel, his policies towards Israel, but Harris has an opportunity to really at least make an effort at garnering that vote, because exactly as you were saying there, I mean, there are so many Americans who are in a position right now where they're looking at November 5th and they're going, I'm not going to vote for the Democrat or the Republican. Some of them are going to go and vote third party. Maybe they'll vote for Green Party candidate Jill Stein or Libertarian Chase Oliver, because they have spoken out, right? They have called this what it is, an ongoing genocide that is being enabled by the US. And so there's always that possibility, but there's also the possibility that they just stay home and that they don't vote. And the fact that the two major parties think that they can win, that they don't even need to even try to pander to that vote is just baffling to me. It's also incredibly concerning to know that as we're watching all of this, Netanyahu is also watching all of this. He knows that he's getting away with every single massacre that he's carrying out right now because the Biden administration isn't going to stop him, right? They're not going to step in and hold them accountable in any way. But as he looks forward to January of 2025, when he gets someone new in the White House, he's looking at Harris and Trump and knowing, okay, it's very likely that it's going to be one of these two. And because of that, he knows that with Trump, he's going to get even more of a green light, if that's even possible at this point. He also knows with Harris that she doesn't care enough and that he is going to be able to talk her into whatever he wants. And he knows on top of that, that given the fact that the US has responded to every major escalation that Israel has carried out in recent months by sending more and more troops to the region, by bolstering the US military presence in the region, by increasing the sitting ducks that they have sitting in the region. He knows that he has the full backing of the US, and that even as right now he's looking at a possible ground invasion of Lebanon that could lead to a potential World War III scenario, he knows that the US is with him 100%. And I cannot think of anything more dangerous than that.
Lastly, Rachel, and I'm grateful for your time. I know you have another engagement. In your country, they're always complaining about foreign interference in your elections. But I distinctly saw the crook of Kiev, little Zelensky, flown to the United States in an American military aeroplane. Then I saw him campaigning in Pennsylvania for the Democrats. I saw him, and to his everlasting shame, the governor of Pennsylvania signing missiles destined to hit Russian cities and Russian people, signing their names on them as an autograph. This is open electoral interference by Zelensky in American politics, is it not?
Oh, absolutely. And I'm right there with you. I mean, we knew that Zelensky was coming to the US this week. Initially, it was put out there that he was going to meet with Biden and Harris and Trump and making it look like he's spreading the love around and getting everyone on board with his so-called victory plan. And then he shows up and he stops in Pennsylvania and he goes and meets with Governor Josh Shapiro, who initially was a top contender to be Kamala Harris's running mate. Ironically, part of the reason why it's at least assumed that he didn't get picked was because he was so overly pro-Israel and pro-genocide that the Democrats actually looked at Shapiro and thought, we can't do that. We're going to go with Tim Walz. You know, he seems like he could be your dad or your friend or your neighbor. We'll go with him. He's much more relatable, may not help you win one of these swing states, but more relatable. So they decide not to go with Josh Shapiro. Well, turns out that Governor Shapiro is also incredibly pro-war when it comes to Ukraine. He just enjoys the massacre of civilians all over the place, as it seems. And for Zelensky to go, and to then on top of that, he's been very openly critical of Trump, claiming that Trump doesn't understand the war in Ukraine because Trump says that he wants to end it and is promising to do so. On top of that, Zelensky is criticizing Trump's running mate, J.D. Vance, saying that he's too radical because he also is very critical of U.S. military support for Ukraine. And it's become very clear that Zelensky wants Biden, Harris, Blinken, and company to stay in office, right? In fact, he needs them to stay in office. But what is kind of fascinating to me is that he's not even trying to gain the support of Republicans. And there's a good chance that Donald Trump could be sitting in the White House in just a few months. And Zelensky could find himself in a position where he's having to figure out how to convince a new Trump administration to give him more and more support when the US right now is propping up Ukraine's government, military, social services sector, and on and on. And so the fact that you see Zelensky in this position where, one, he's not even trying, on the other hand, he's making it very clear who he prefers. It just makes me wonder if it was Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping who was doing something similar, the US would be screaming election interference to the hills. But when it's Zelensky or when it's AIPAC funneling $100 million into congressional races to get their preferred candidate in office, then all of a sudden there's no concern about it. The hypocrisy truly never ends here.
Unless Zelensky knows something about the outcome of November's election that we yet don't. Rachel Blevins, thanks as always for joining us. This time on No to NATO, No to War. We'll let you get away to your other engagement and ask now for our second speaker. I told you we were linking 3 continents. How about that? We've just heard from the Americas. Let's go down under to Australasia, to a man who has become an internet sensation, a man who is now avidly followed by millions of people around the globe. He rejoices in the wonderful social media name of the Aussie Cossack, and he joins us now. What would you like to say, my dear sir, about the current juncture at which we find ourselves, and tell us something of the role of Australia in all of this?
George, thanks for having me. Look, Australia, unfortunately, like a puppet of the West, is following the Zelensky tune, having already handed over more than $1.1 billion in aid to Zelensky. Compared to the American contribution, the European contribution, it's not a lot of money. But for Australia, who has a small military, Australia is demilitarizing itself, surrendering its armored vehicles, its missiles, its 777 artillery systems. And now the Ukrainian government is demanding that Australia hands over its last 59 Abrams tanks, that are in storage, claiming that they need them in the war against Russia. I mean, countries like China would be sitting back and looking at the demilitarization of Australia and potentially encouraging that demilitarization. Should there be a conflict in the future in the Pacific, which is highly likely, Australia is shooting itself in the foot and will be crying crocodile tears in the future when all of this weaponry, which could be used to bolster Australia's defense capability or its defense reputation, at least on paper, is now being plundered. And unfortunately, the Australian public can do nothing about that. People are against this. People are against handing over taxpayer money to Zelensky, exporting and gifting, demilitarizing Australia's weaponry. But unfortunately, with the Albanese government in power, the way Prime Minister Albanese behaves towards dissent, towards any sort of freedom of speech, is now trying to rush through new legislation in Parliament, the disinformation bill, to make sure that nobody can criticize the government or the government's policies. So it's a dystopian nightmare. And if it was up to the Australian people, of course, Australia had nothing to do with this war and nothing to do with Zelensky. The average Australian does not see Russia as an enemy, absolutely not. And it's the Australian government, unfortunately, who are a part of the globalist alliances and are following blindly. In fact, who are we following? Because who is in charge of the United States? It's certainly not Joe Biden. Is it Kamala Harris? We don't know who we are following, but I'm sure if Trump does win the US election, the upcoming election, there'll be quite a few very uncomfortable Australian politicians who have been openly criticizing Trump. And if he comes back into power, well, Australia traditionally toes the US line. It'll be interesting to see how Australia follows the new leader, Donald Trump, should he get back in. But I, like many out there, hope that Trump wins, but I know deep down inside that the deep state is capable of anything. They're capable of rigging the elections, and Kamala Harris will win. And if she does win, there will be World War III. In fact, we're already probably in World War III. The only thing that can stop World War III is if leaders like Orban, Xi Jinping, Putin, Trump sit down and sort things out. And it won't take long. It will take 24 hours, as Trump said. But with Kamala Harris entering the White House, it's going to be probably something along the lines of having Hillary Clinton as president. Endless wars, more escalation, and certainly no good news on the horizon. But I say no good news not for Russia, because Russia will fight. This is the problem. The Russian people will fight. The Russian people have lost tens of millions in previous wars. They may lose millions in this war, but they will not give up their country. They will not give up their sovereignty, and they will protect Russian speakers in Ukraine, which is what this is all about. Most of the Ukrainian population are Russian speakers, especially the south and the east. And Russia has every right to defend those territories against the Zelensky Nazi regime. And Russia has always defended those areas and that land. And there's no reason why at this time in history Russia should stand by and allow Nazism, fascism to manifest on its borders unchallenged. So Russia will fight. The question is, will the West fight? Have a look at the generation of people that are growing up now that are in the armed forces of Western countries. Do they really look like the kind of people who will take up arms, who will die for not even their countries, but another country, a separate country? I don't think so. Really, I don't think so. But unfortunately, for the West, the Russians are dead serious. And when it comes to nuclear weapons or tactical nuclear weapons or launching a complete nuclear attack, Russia will certainly not hesitate if it's threatened to press the button.
And yet, you have a Labour government. Indeed, one of the common characteristics of the warmongers in the Western world, they are the centre left. Sometimes they prefer to be called centrists. Sometimes they pretend to be leftists. But the governments of the United States, of Britain, of France, and of Germany, and of Australia are all centre left. What is it about the centre left that loves war so much?
Well, we grew up looking at the left with some type of respect when the left was about trade unions and workers' rights. And in fact, the left was against war. It was the left who was marching against the war in Vietnam. It was the West there was the left who was marching against interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq and Korea and other places. But now the left, for example, in Australia, is unrecognizable. It's these values, these anti-war values that the left, the honourable left, should I say, once had, have been replaced by this bizarre pro-war push, where this new centre-left, as you speak of, the Labor government in Australia, are pushing for war. And I don't think they really think this through. Australia has every chance to be neutral, every chance to avoid conflict. It's a country that's far enough away to survive, in fact, probably a nuclear war if it's not involved. I mean, why build American bases in Australia to tease the Chinese? The Chinese just this week, for the first time in decades, tested an intercontinental ballistic missile, which is capable of reaching Australia with a range of 12,000 kilometers. That's a sign to Australia. Stay out of it. Australia could prosper if it was neutral, if it was a strong, neutral country which had its own independent foreign policy, away from AUKUS, the alliance which Australia is being dragged into, where Australia is paying hundreds of billions of dollars to the United States for submarines which we might get in 2040 or 2050. And Australia, as a country which is often referred to as the lucky country, it's becoming unluckier every day as we go, because it's putting itself into danger. There's no reason for Australia to be involved in World War III. Australia shouldn't be involved in World War III. Unfortunately, Albanese, our Prime Minister in Australia, he's about as lost as Joe Biden. In fact, when you put the two of them together, they look like brothers or partners in crime. And the future is bleak, because when we talk about Labor governments, Labor controls all the states in Australia. It controls the federal government. And the reason why Labor is in power is because the Greens vote in Australia gives its preferences to Labor, and the Australian right is in complete disarray. It's very disorganized, and I don't see any prospects for regime change in Australia. It doesn't really matter at the end of the day whether it's the Liberal Party or the Labor Party who is in power in Australia. Australia is going to toe the deep state line. So until we have an independent third party, a third force, which the government is terrified of, which is why they're enacting all of this censorship, and they're shutting down any strong voices, jailing people, jailing protesters, forbidding people from making memes against the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister wants to enact legislation to ban social media users. Albanese threatened Elon Musk with fines of 5% of Elon Musk's revenue if he didn't adhere to Australia's policies on censorship. Elon Musk called the Albanese a fascist, and the Australian government a fascist government, and that unfortunately is what it's becoming. And but that it's no surprise that the fascist Australian Albanese regime is sponsoring and supplying weapons to the Nazi regime in Kiev of Zelensky.
You've taken me where I intended to go, namely into the South China Sea, into the Straits of Taiwan. The AUKUS, America, UK, Australian alliance, and these mythical submarines that might emerge in 2050 if we ever get there as a human race, and for which you're paying through your collective noses, is all part of the preparation for war with China. That we purposely called this episode tonight the roads, plural, roads to World War III. And one of those roads lies right across the Pacific, right all the way to the South China Sea, in which it's obviously the case that Australia will be expected to play a significant part.
Look, unfortunately, Australia is being pushed into this role. Let me just say, if China decides one day to invade Taiwan, there is nothing Australia can do about it, and there's nothing Australia should do about it. Australia has nothing in terms of military capabilities to stand up to any type of conflict, and neither should it. Australia is enjoying hundreds of billions of dollars in profits every year from selling iron ore to China. China buys this iron ore and builds ships, weaponry. They have more than 1,000 Navy ships, of surface fleet of more than 1,000 ships. It's massive, it's huge, and they're building every day. They're building missiles every day. They're building thousands and thousands of missiles and drones every day. Chinese manufacturing can be very quickly switched to producing weaponry. Now, why would we poke the dragon? And why would we poke the dragon and poke the bear at the same time? And this is where the virtue signaling actions of the Australian Navy in the South China Sea, around Taiwan, on the coast of China, are completely inappropriate. I mean, how would Australia like it if the Chinese Navy was conducting exercises outside Sydney Harbour? Now, of course, it would be very unpleasant. But of course, this is not Australia's decision. Australia is being pushed into this and forced into this by the United States. And the United States won't hesitate to throw Australia under the bus in the event of a Pacific war. Australia is a prime target for any country in the event of a war, because Australia has such a small population, 27 million people, a huge, great, beautiful country full of natural resources, which is underexploited, underdeveloped. I mean, from along the East Coast, you could build another 35 Sydneys. And that's exactly what a country like China would do if Australia was foolish enough to jump in a war. Now, it won't be China aggressively invading Australia. It'll be Australia foolish enough to follow AUKUS, to follow America, to follow people like Kamala Harris or Joe Biden into a war with China. And that's what will happen unless Australia sticks to neutrality. We have no reason to fight. The Chinese government, the Chinese people, they're not interested in fighting. They're interested in making money. They're interested in building up their country. China hasn't had any war for a very long time, and the rest of the world have been in war and have suffered. Look what it's done to America. America is in trillions and trillions of dollars of debt, and most of that debt is in fact owed to countries like China. So, of course, war is in one way essential for the US economy. We understand that the economy will stop unless there's constant conflicts. But from the other perspective, for China, War is not a good thing, but China is ready for war. And that's why stay away from China. Australia shouldn't be aggressive. It's a laughing stock, really. Our government in Australia is a laughing stock when they threaten China or claim to be a potential party to a war, whether it be in the Philippines or in Taiwan or wherever. It's inappropriate. It's silly. Most Australians criticize their own government. Problem is, no one listens to Australians because the Albanese government completely toes the line of the globalists, of the deep state, and whatever is dictated to Australia from Washington.
Yeah, not many masters listen to willing servants, that's for sure. Lastly, the last time, just like Michigan, the point I made to Rachel Blevins, the last time I spoke in Australia, I was acutely conscious that there are a huge number of people in Australia who are of Lebanese descent, of Arab descent, of Lebanese descent. What's the impact on them within Australian society of the massacres in Lebanon over the last couple of days?
That's a great question, and I'm asking the same question. I'd like to take this opportunity to appeal to the Lebanese diaspora, a very large Lebanese diaspora, the Lebanese Maronite Catholics, the Lebanese Orthodox, the Lebanese Muslims in Australia. It's time to stand up. It's time to rise. Your homeland, your ancestral homeland, your historical homeland, a country where you were born, or at least your parents were born, is being invaded. There's a war. And the Lebanese diaspora, I have to be honest, has been largely silent because, Hezbollah has been involved for a while now in the current conflict, and the Lebanese diaspora is quite silent. Now, Lebanese youth, Lebanese Middle Eastern in general communities, they can be quite vocal. They can hit the streets. They can put up a fight. They can raise their voices when they need to. And this is the time where the Lebanese communities in Australia need to stand up. Now, the Australian government, of course, the New South Wales Multicultural Department and other government organisations, they spend a lot of money in keeping the diasporas, you could say, quiet, but basically making sure that there is no community sentiment. And I understand from the point of view of counterterrorism that that's necessary, but we're not asking anyone to be violent. We're asking people to rise up, stand up, and speak up for your homeland. Speak up for Lebanon. Lebanon's being bombed in the last few days. It's in the middle of a war. There are lots of Lebanese in Australia, and there are lots of very wealthy Lebanese in Australia, very powerful Lebanese in Australia. It's time to mobilize. It's time to mobilize, and it's absolutely normal. Every diaspora supports its own. You look at a very powerful diaspora of another certain country in the Middle East, a very small country, but a very powerful country, an influential country. And we won't name which country that is, but their lobby groups are very strong in Parliament, in the media, in Australia, in every echelon of government, local, state and federal, in policy making and so forth. So take example, take note of that, and to the Lebanese in Australia, stand up, rise up, put pressure on the Australian government to do more, to denounce what's happening now in Lebanon, the war against Lebanon that's being waged. Your countrymen are dying. We can see clearly that homes, residential areas are being bombed with artillery, with missiles, US-supplied missiles, US-supplied bombs that are being used by the Israeli Defense Force.
Aussie Cossack, it's a delight for me to finally meet you at last. I've been following your output for some considerable time. I hope everyone will follow you on social media. Aussie Cossack, thanks for joining us on No to NATO, No to War. And everyone should take note that there are at least 3 roads to World War III. One of them runs through the Persian Gulf via the Levant. One of them runs through the Ukraine, and the other runs through Australia on the road to China. These are the 3 paths that may be burned on the way to World War III. Now, our final speaker tonight is an English journalist, investigative reporter of note. Mr. Warren Thornton, to whom I offer the floor for the third and final speech. Warren, welcome to No to NATO, No to War.
Thank you very much, George. It is very straightforward when you look at what is happening in the world, and you look at the problem that we have with our new Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, or as I like to say, this gentleman is leading us to Starmageddon, and anybody who turns round, speaks out against this, will soon very quickly be visited by his stormtroopers, where the freedom of speech has completely gone by the wall. When you look at what Starmer did, first of all, to get elected, do not forget that his pals in the Israel lobby and many of his faction managed to oust a Labour Party that was totally against wars and got rid of Jeremy Corbyn. We also have to look, do we not, when Starmer spoke at the UN about how the death of innocent civilians in Gaza was absolutely terrible. He also spoke about the death of journalists and aid workers, particularly UNRWA workers, and that this was unacceptable and called for a ceasefire. He then didn't mention whatsoever literally the flights from Akrotiri base in Cyprus that were flying over and actually targeting these refugees to be killed. So we are complicit, and Starmer is also complicit in war crimes. There's no question whatsoever. You have to remember as well that Starmer has received £50,000 from the Israel lobby, and that is an absolutely documented fact. Now, he also was speaking about how terrible this is and what a civilian loss of life it is. It doesn't matter which flag you are standing under. If you kill civilians and you kill children, you are a war criminal. And we, Britain, are complicit in that by doing the targeting for Israel. And they have hit civilian populations, they have hit refugee camps, they have hit hospitals, they have hit journalists by the bucket load. More people, journalists and aid workers, have died in Gaza than in any other conflict, and that's simply because they've been targeted. Also, you would have heard Starmer at the UN having a go, saying that Russia started this war and that they are the aggressors and they have moved towards trying to get some sort of parcel of Ukraine, I think would probably be Starmer's best way of putting it. Let's not forget the idiot of a foreign secretary that they had, which is David Lammy, who didn't know that who thought the colour revolution was in Yugoslavia with his appearances on Mastermind, and thought that Henry VII was the person who succeeded Henry VIII. Quite staggering that this gentleman should be, first of all, our foreign secretary. He then turned around and said, I stand here as a black man, while he was sitting, and it had nothing to do whatsoever with being black. It had to do with wars. Now back onto Starmer. He forgot that the original NATO members, there were only 12 of them, and that in 1990, Edward Shevardnadze, Baker, who was the then Secretary of State for the United States, and Mikhail Gorbachev sat down, and it is on United States memo paper that they would not take 1 inch further eastwards should a unified Germany join NATO, which they promptly did. After that, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, Albania, Croatia, Montenegro, North Macedonia, Finland, and Sweden have all joined NATO. I would like to ask the question, was it Russia that moved further west, or was it NATO that moved further east? And you have to remember as well, when we come to the war in Ukraine, NATO were crawling around inside Ukraine well before 2022. We had a gentleman called Heli Arnoux of the French intelligence service living in Kiev for 7 months, going to the Golden Gate public house, which was a well-known mercenary meeting place, setting up NATO bunkers and living only 200 yards in the other direction away from the Armenian embassy. Guess who is now the French defense military attaché for the Armenians? It is, of course, Heli Arnoux, having been promoted. We also have to remember their awful role that they played in helping to start this war. You look at England's role as well, and Starmer actually came out and said that Putin had smuggled or stolen or kidnapped 20,000 children, despite the fact that the videos of him looking after those children going to school, being perfectly happy and moving to Russia with their parents was freely available. He produced that video evidence at the UN, which the UK, Albania, Malta, and the USA didn't stick around for. They got up and walked out because they'd already accused Russia of this and didn't want to be found out by their own evidence. Not also mentioning 266,000 children that have been moved from their families in Ukraine and have suddenly disappeared out of nowhere. And we know this because we've spoken to some of the mothers who managed to get their children back from other countries, namely the UK and the US. And when you have a look at these people and you see how far they encroached on Russia by NATO moving further eastward, just imagine for a second if Putin had put missiles in Mexico, Alaska, or Hawaii, or indeed he'd have put missiles in Ireland, Jersey, or the Orkneys. What would our response have been? Now, they were warned in 2008. They were warned in 2014. We've had all sorts of agreements that have been broken, and not by the Russians. Let's not forget the peace conference that was meant to be in 2022, when they actually spoke to each other. A deal was agreed, and suddenly Boris Johnson went over at the behest of Biden, and there was no deal left on the table. And let's not forget that one of those chief negotiators fell out of a window in Turkey while on holiday. Can you hear me okay?
Sound, Warren, on the anticipation that you can hear me. Let me ask for your comment on the point that was made in the English newspapers this morning, that the British public will have to be prepared to fight over what side of a line the town of Kupiansk, that British people have never heard of, and which has been in 4 different countries in the last 100 years, that the British public will have to be prepared to fight because the British armed forces are so small. Now, we at No2Nato, No to War have pledged all out opposition. We will bristle with opposition against any attempt to conscript our young people to die for Zelensky in Ukraine. What do you think the British public's reaction will be to the idea that they better pack their tin hat and pick up their gun and head for the railway station and Eastern Europe?
Well, it's simply not going to happen, George, because very simply, they're not going to go and fight for Starmer when he's taken away the money from their grandmothers and grandfathers who are going to freeze to death this winter. He's going to put tax up through the roof. You go and fight for a cause. You go and fight for people you believe in. Now, Putin is seen not only as a political leader, but a spiritual leader as well. I would ask the question, would you have gone and fought for Sunak? Would you go and fight for Starmer? Of course you won't. And let's not forget, in the British Armed Forces, we're down 5.5% in people leaving. In the Navy, we're down 7%, and in the Air Force, we're down another 3.5% as well. There is no taste for this war amongst the British public. Keir Starmer is the most unpopular leader there's ever been after such a short stay in office, and one wonders whether his term will be okay. And let's not also forget that whilst he was making his tub-thumping speeches, that Britain is completely out of ammunition. Our stocks are so depleted that they can no longer keep the levels going. And indeed, we are down to our bare munitions to protect our own country, having given so much to Ukraine. And of course, we're going to give even more money, pour it into a black hole, while more Ukrainians die. There is no way that British people are going to go and fight. They will have to do what they're doing in Ukraine at the moment, and that is press gang people to go into the army, and that won't go well, George.
And indeed, the entire British Armed Forces, Army, Navy, and Air Force could comfortably fit into Villa Park in Birmingham, a mid-table football stadium. Now, it falls to you to speak for Europe as a whole tonight, Warren. So I'd like your comment on just how popular these policies of war and sanctions are turning out to be in, for example, Germany.
Yeah, absolutely not. The rise of the AfD for Germany, very simple. Annalena Baerbock, who is probably one of the biggest war hawks out there, her Green Party has gone completely through the floor. Scholz is tumbling in the polls, and he's only just ahead of the AfD. And of course, they're being labelled right wing, as everybody is. But let's not forget the rise of Maloney. Look at very simply Macron, what's happening to him. He's literally falling through the floor. Trudeau will be stepping down. Not surprising, since he had a standing ovation for a Nazi in the Canadian Parliament, which we got a visit from the police pointing out. It is one of those, the only friends he really, the only people that are really up for war are people like the lunatic in Argentina, Millet, and of course we have little Estonia flapping its gums. And you have to remember that there were over 120,000 people or Ukrainians that were killed in Bakhmut, okay, over the space of 8 months. That is the general fighting force, because you've got a lot of admin and everything else. So if you took the German and the French and the British armed forces together and stuck them in Bakhmut, they would have been wiped out by now.
Incredible. WarrenThornton.com, a man very well worth following and an excellent contribution to bring us towards the end of this important episode of No to NATO, No to War. I have a very important announcement to make. So serious is the situation we feel that we have decided to launch a crowdfunding appeal to appoint a full-time organizer of No to NATO, No to War. That person will be charged with making the links necessary in all the countries of NATO and beyond that want to stop this never-ending drive to war. It's a £20,000 war chest or anti-war chest that we are seeking to fill, and it will be entirely used to fund a full-time organizer. We will accept donations from anywhere in the world, as we are entitled to do, not being a registered political party. So wherever you are watching this in the world, you can contribute. Your little contribution will go a long way if it is joined by others to raising that fighting fund. So let me launch this evening, having talked about fighting and war all evening. Let's launch a fighting fund, a crowd fund, to raise £20,000 to employ a full-time organizer for No to NATO, No to War. If everybody who watches this were to give 5 cents, if everyone watching this were to give €1, $1, £1, then we would reach our target of £20,000 in no time at all. I hope that at the conclusion of this broadcast, the crowdfund details will appear on your screen. But in any case, our social media output will be full of how you can make your contribution. We don't want £20,000 from one individual. We want to show the width, the depth of the revulsion of the public in all corners of the world against the state we are in. There are 3 roads to World War III. We currently have soldiers on every single one of those 3 roads. We have to stop them. We have to turn them back and return them safely to their barracks and to the bosom of their own families. Enough is enough. Enough people have died already in Gaza, in Lebanon, in Iran. Enough people have died in Ukraine. Enough people will die. Indeed, all of us may die if any one of these three great flashpoints in the Persian Gulf, the Levant, in Eastern Europe, and the Ukraine, and not least but last, the People's Republic of China, which celebrates its 75th anniversary this very weekend. China, 75 years young, will not be long in making itself felt on the international stage. We have to work to ensure that engagement between their peoples and ours are peaceful, productive, and fruitful for all of us. The alternative being we all go up in smoke and turn to ash. I've been George Galloway. I'd like to thank Rachel Blevins, Aussie Cossack, and WarrenThornton.com for their contribution to tonight's meeting. I thank you for watching and appeal to you directly. Give now to the appeal for a full-time organizer for No2Nato, No to War. Until next time, good night.